The latest. Thank you for your love and support. I appreciate you. Oh, sorry about my voice. A British professor sends a message to African Union. According to this professor, Professor Bigger, Britain do not owe Africans anything because Britain fought passionately against slave trade. According to him, Britain did not invent slave trade. That slave trade or slavery was a universal thing, and African elites participated fully in the slave trade. And for that matter, they do not owe us anything. And if we think that all the industrialization that we are seeing in Britain is as a result of slave trade, we need to wake up that even though some people were enriched through that, but that isn't what they use to build Britain. And this is amazing. And we ask if stopping a crime is the same thing as justice. Stories don't work that way. History doesn't work that way. And morality, real morality certainly doesn't. Imagine a town that wakes up one morning to silence. For years, people had vanished in the night. Families learned not to ask questions. Children learned to grow up without parents. And one day, it all just ended. The kidnapping stopped. The violence ceased. The perpetrators laid down their weapons and congratulated themselves for choosing peace. Will the empty houses suddenly refill? Will the dead return? Will the stolen years quietly knit themselves back together? Of course not. Stopping evil is not the same as confronting it. Ending a crime doesn't wash away the blood that it left behind. And yet, this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. In faith, repentance is never silent. It speaks. It names the harm. It stands before the victim and says, I did this. And if repair is possible, it tries knowing it will never be enough, but trying anyway because love demands the attempt.
You're a Christian theologian, and you're saying we shouldn't feel guilty at all about 3 million Africans being taken out of their homes and moved to across the Atlantic? The guilt is imaginary?
By all means, Britain should acknowledge responsibility for that. So should African countries, and they don't.
That's not true.
It's a matter of fairness.
That's not true.
It's a matter of fairness.
That's not true.
The African Union...
Benin...
The African Union...
Hold on. You said African countries have not. That is factually untrue.
Comprising lots of African
Well, we're not in the European Union, as people know anymore, so let's forget about unions.
The African Union...
Well, we're not in the EU.
A few weeks ago had said that it plans to submit a bill to Britain for reparations for slavery.
Great.
When lots of African countries, especially in the West Africa, were involved in it.
You're not dealing with the central point, which is you said African countries have not apologized or not involved in some form of reparations. Uganda and Benin have both formally apologized. Why can't we follow them and do the same?
Apologize. Okay.
For a formal state apology. Why can't the British government do it?
Because we apologized 200 years ago by stopping it and suppressing it.
That's not an apology.
It's much more than an apology.
Nigel, you are a professor.
Much more than
you
an
are
apology.
a professor of moral theology. And when I hear you speak, if I went out, if me and all my neighbors killed everyone in the local area, hold on, let me finish my analogy. Let's pretend that I'm your student in class. I'm making my pitch to you as a professor. If me and all my friends killed everyone in the local area, we constantly killed and kidnapped people in the local area, and then I stopped doing it, and I then made all my neighbors stop doing it, you're telling me that any kind of justice for the people I killed or kidnapped, that they've had any kind of accountability, that I've made up for what I did just by stopping doing it. Stopping committing a crime, you don't get a prize for stopping committing a crime.
Well, okay.
You tell me, where am I wrong? Morally, where am I wrong?
I think if you're among the first peoples in the history of the world to stop doing something that is very common, I think you should get some credit for that, especially if it cost you. And I think you should also get credit for spending a century and a half suppressing it from Brazil to New Zealand at cost. Can you make up for what happened to those people then? No, you can't. Can we make up for what happened to the medieval serfs who were exploited, or the early industrial workers who were stolen? No, we can't.
Hold on. We did lose people, as you say. You keep mentioning the cost. Several hundred, some say more than 1,000 British sailors were involved in sacrificed their lives, and that is undeniably true. 3 million slaves were taken by the British Empire across the Atlantic. 300,000 of them or more died just crossing over the Atlantic. Whatever we did to cancel it out pales into insignificance with the original crime. And when you talk about, we can't do anything about it, they're already dead. Funny that we managed to find £20 million at the time, which was equivalent to 40% of the government budget, to compensate the slave owners. We compensated the slave owners, but not the slaves or the victims of slavery.
And the reason for
How is that not a huge moral wrong, morally?
No, it wasn't morally wrong, partly because that was required to get abolition through the British Parliament. Had it not been
that's Nigel Biggar, the Conservative peer speaking. That's a politician. That is not a moral assessment.
Well,
morally, that's irrelevant what was needed to go through Parliament.
No, Mehdi, no. If you want to get slavery abolished, that was the political cost. And if you don't pay that cost, then slavery gets extended. I think that was a morally justifiable political compromise. The other reason for paying compensation to the owners of slaves was to enable sugar plantations to remain viable businesses after abolition. Why? Yes, of course, so that investors could continue to make a profit, but also so that emancipated slaves would have some means of earning a wage.
So why can't people today, in the Caribbean, for example, the CARICOM, as you know, the Association of Caribbean States, they're asking for, what their number one request is in their 10-point list of reparations? A formal apology. That costs us nothing. Why can't we do that?
Well, if you think a formal apology is more important than the actual process of abolition and the process of worldwide suppression, if you think that's more important, then I guess we could say the words.
These false binaries now. Who's saying that that's not important? We're saying that's not enough, as you yourself agreed.
I guess what I'm saying is I think the act was a costly apology. But you want the words added? I'm sure we could add the words.
But they haven't. The British government has refused to do that. In fact, it tried to block the EU from doing it earlier. Let's go to our panel of experts who are waiting here to come in. Kojo, Nigel says it's just not possible. It wasn't possible then. It's not possible now. This isn't an issue of morality, or if it is, it's about getting slavery ended. We paid the price to the slave owners. What's wrong with that view?
I think that we always try to frame the idea of reparations as though it's an impossibility, when in fact we see it pretty prevalent within both international and transnational justice movements of the current moment. We can look at not just the German reparations paid towards victims of the Holocaust, we can look at the German paying reparations to the victims of the genocide in modern-day Namibia. And we understand the mechanisms that could allow for that ability to transfer resources over time to people who have been the long-term victims. If we could do that with the compensation of the enslavers with the Slave Compensation Act in 1837, which comes after the Emancipation Act in 1834, then we absolutely have the technology to be able to do that in the current day.
Lawrence Goldman, do you disagree with that?
3 points. One, in 1832-33, a Whig cabinet had to push for emancipation. And the slaveholders in the Caribbean set the price at 40 million. 40 million was what they wanted. And the Whigs beat them down to 20 million. Now, it was not controversial. If you look at political records, if you look at the correspondence, nobody thought it was controversial at all. That was the price that had to be paid, and the British were prepared. Their government was prepared.
Got it.
It's a deal.
Point
it's
2
a deal.
and 3. Time is short.
Okay. Simply, again, to keep morality out of this, because sometimes you just have to do things which are painful, but not in a moral framework. But secondly, let's think about apologies for a moment, and let me be a moralist for a second.
Okay.
What would be the validity of an apology by people who've nothing to do with slavery, who live generations after it ended, who live in a multicultural society where tens of millions of us were not even here? What are we apologizing for? Something that we never did. And who are we apologizing to? People who were never slaves. It would be empty. It would have no significance. Okay. It would destroy the idea of an apology.
It's a very common and strong argument. I'm going to interrupt you before we get to point 3 and say, Kojo, do you want to respond to that point?
I think that when we talk about what would be the value of acknowledging the violence of transatlantic slavery and also of trying to make reparative justice, we are thinking about what happens in the present, not just in the past. I think that in the moment of a changing world in which we have a growing multipolarity, Britain is looking to try and re-establish its relationships with its former colonial countries in the Commonwealth. Of course, that problem emerged when it turned out that the Foreign Office had codenamed that trade strategy Empire 2.0. And so this is part of the myopia that happens when we try to extend ourselves into the currently changing world without acknowledging the violence and the pain of people we are then trying to facilitate trade relationships with.
Let me bring in Gominda Bambra, who's been waiting patiently. Gominda, Nigel makes the point that empire is part of human history. We talked about this earlier. He also makes the point that slavery is part of human history. He mentioned, quote unquote, Islamic slavery and other forms of slavery. What's your response to that? What would you say?
I mean, well, I think there's a real issue about the lack of specificity about what is being talked about. It is just not true that all societies had forms of slavery that were equivalent in any way. What emerges with the European trade in human beings is a very distinct form of slavery which involves the transaction of human beings. So you have forms of servitude and you have forms of coerced labor in societies where there weren't previously ideas of free labor. What's distinct about the emergence of chattel slavery, as the Europeans undertake it, is that what's happening in Europe at the time is the emergence of the idea of free labor. So to have free labor at home, but to kidnap and enslave populations elsewhere and to transact them, and that's a very distinct form from any other type of serfdom, servitude, or forms of bondage that exist in any other part of the world.
Nigel.
So I fully accept that there were different forms of slavery. I need to ponder what you've said, quite understand the significance of it. What I don't accept is that the form of enslavement that the Europeans engaged in was uniquely brutal. It was very brutal, it wasn't uniquely so. In terms of reparations, to finger the British alone, and it's only the British or Europeans who are being fingered, is just unfair, given the fact that we abolished it, we suppressed it, we paid for that, and that no one is asking money from Africa, and West Africans were involved in enslaving other Africans at least from the 1500s onwards.
Very briefly.
The abolition of slavery was followed by a century or more of indenture. So it's not as if abolition was the end of the story. So we often talk about abolition as if it's the end of the story of European involvement in the enslavement of populations. Not only do we not talk about enslavement within the Indian Ocean world, but only focus on transatlantic slavery, but we also don't then look at the systems of indenture that took millions of Indians and Chinese to the Caribbean. Indenture is not different to enslavement.
Morally speaking, indenture and slavery are not the same thing.
Just on slavery, though, before I do want to go to the audience, you could have written a book and said, I think that we did a great job ending slavery, which we did. But I don't know if this is just because it helps you become a bestseller, but you add this line, the tyranny of imaginary guilt. You're a Christian theologian, and you're saying we shouldn't feel guilty at all about 3 million Africans being taken out of their homes and moved to across the Atlantic? The guilt is imaginary? Why can't we have guilt and also believe everything you just said?
First of all, we can only feel guilt for something we did.
We did. We did take 3 million people out of Africa.
You and I didn't. No, you and I didn't. I can lament what some of our ancestors did. I can't feel guilty for it.
So that means hold on. So you're telling me with a straight face, you don't take pride in Britain, in us defeating the Nazis in World War II? You've never taken pride in that?
I take pride in it. I admire the fact of what
How can you take pride in it? It's not us.
Well, no, of course. I can't claim the credit for having done that because I didn't. My parents did. I didn't.
We as British people take pride.
Only indirectly. So
why can't we take guilt indirectly?
In terms of guilt, because you cannot be guilty for something you didn't do. You can be responsible for the effects. You can't be guilty for it.
But you can take pride in something you didn't do. But you can take pride in something you didn't do.
metaphorically. So I prefer to use the word admiration now.
Okay, but most British people take pride in our...
Here the story bends. The past is suddenly treated like a closed book. The suffering is reframed as inevitable, a common for a times, as something that no one alive today needs to carry. The weight is declared imagery, the wound inconvenient, and yet the descendants still live with a scar. Across generations, the consequences didn't vanish. They hardened, they shaped borders, wealth, poverty, power, and moral. The past doesn't stay behind. It moves forward quietly into present. To say that no apology is needed is to confuse silence with peace. To say that something was enough is to mistake restraint for justice. Even the most basic human instinct knows this. You don't praise someone for ceasing to harm. You ask them to face what they did. This is where the story became less about nations and more about conscience, about whether morality is something we apply consistently or only when it costs us nothing, about whether faith is a living guide for a convenient shield. Because if justice only matters when it is easy, then it isn't justice at all. It's comfort. And so the question lingers, not shouted, not argued, but quietly present, like a truth that refuses to leave. We are the only ones that can set ourselves free. United we stand, divided we fall. And united we keep standing forever and ever. The greatest enemy of the African is mental slavery. So let's decolonize ourselves from mental slavery. Let's keep sharing to educate our brothers and sisters. Together we'll make Africa great for ourselves and the next generations that are going to come. So that's the latest around the world. And in the United Kingdom,